Climate change and racism have a lot in common. Most notably, what people do not believe about them. People do not believe that they're real problems. They don't believe that humans created them and it's not just the way things are. People don't believe that it impacts all of us and not just some of us. And people do not believe that all of us perpetuate them. It's interesting because climate change and racism are also very interconnected. The reality is that although climate change will impact all of us, make no mistakes about it, people of color and other marginalized groups will disproportionately bear the effects of climate change, and we're already seeing that now. What we've learned from disasters is that we can pretty much predict the outcomes if we understand what the infrastructure, what the environmental, social, and economic challenges are that are tearing at our communities right now, every day, and have been. On the other side of that, though, is that when we look at the opportunities to address issues of climate change and to prepare ourselves for what that means, we also see the way that people of color are left out of those opportunities. When we think about what happens with the environmental justice movements, what's happening with the climate justice movements, that they're very segregated racially, and therefore lose the power of what it means when we can come together to work on these issues. The other way that climate change and racism are interconnected in opportunity is when we think about the economic opportunities of the green economy. People of color are being left out of those opportunities as well. So we recognize that racism is a real thing, and we recognize how it's impacting all of us. But what is racism? What is it? Many of us have seen what's happening in our public discourse right now when you turn on the TV, that we have these oversimplified conversations that pit the racist against the non-racist, people of color against white people. We've created this understanding of it that has divided us in a way where we're missing the point, which is an intended consequence of racism, that we miss the point of how we're connected to each other. So how does it start? When was that moment where we learned all of the ideas of who people are and how they're supposed to be? Many of us have heard the definition prejudice plus power, right? It's a little more sophisticated than the common discourse we're seeing on TV right now, but it still is lacking in some context that helps us understand what racism is, how it works, and how it impacts all of us. That context is we're all humans and we're flawed. Congratulations, welcome to the human family. The other part of that, though, is we all prejudge people. It is the way we are wired. It is the way we are designed. From the moment we were born, we've been conditioned to believe certain things about who people of color are, how they're supposed to be, what opportunities they should have access to or not, whose humanity gets respected or not. And so if we think about what that means for us personally, who we are and how we're contributing, that means our understanding of racism is about us as part of a system. On the prejudging people side, we also don't get the full understanding of the fact that those ideas about who people are and how they are aren't just harmful and hurtful to our psychology and to our emotions. But we walk through the doors of institutions with these thoughts, and we're setting up policies, programs, we're deciding who gets hired or not hired. So when we're in institutions and we think about institutional racism, it's not just a building. When we think about the system of racism, it's not just some thing that's hiding behind a curtain, pulling on strings. There's no Oz back there. It's us, all of us, that are part of that system, that are walking through doors of institutions, perpetuating these issues. And so, if we understand that part, that all of us are part of that system, then what do we do about it? What are we supposed to do about it? Well, the other half of that definition I mentioned earlier was plus power, which we never talk about. And there's multiple types of power that are interrelated, interconnected to one another. So first, there's decision-making power. Who's at the table making decisions about all of these different aspects of our lives, and who's not at the table? There's resources. So those people at the table making decisions also determine who gets access to which resources. And then we also have who gets to determine what reality is, the framing of reality, both today and how we think about what's happening in our society. Who is at the root of the problems that we've identified? Who's not? Who are the saviors? It also reflects our history and who gets to frame the reality of our history and our understanding of history, because we're not learning it in school. And if we're not seeking it out, then we're disconnected from it, and we don't understand how we got to the inequities that we see today, and not just racism, all of them. The other form of power that's relevant to this discussion is this whole piece around who gets to set up the norms and standards of what's acceptable in terms of behavior, appearance, who has a monopoly on success. Then there's also this whole idea that we probably never talk about, which is time, the power of time. You see, when you are a person of color at the intersection of poverty and being working poor, you have less time than everybody else, because you're spending your time trying to make that extra money. You're spending your time on longer bus and train rides because you're living in communities that are isolated from the rest of everybody else. It takes longer for you to go grocery shopping because you have a higher likelihood of living in a food desert. Time is a form of power, because that means you can't participate in the same ways in the traditional forms of climate justice and environmental justice movements. We like to set up these meetings, and that's where we expect everyone to show up to work together on these issues. But the reality is some of us don't have the privilege to do that, because time is a form of power and privilege. And last but certainly not least is the power of relationships. Because it's the relationships that help us navigate the dysfunction of the system. You see, institutions and the way they're run and the systems that we keep talking about, they're the things that are broken, not the people. Except some of us have relationships that allow us to navigate the dysfunction to get what we need from that system. Some of us have relationships that allow us to navigate institutions to get that job, get that opportunity that will get you the promotion. So what do we do about all of this? This prejudice plus power, this racism I propose that we hum, date, and diet our way through it. Hang in there with me. First, we have to hum. We have to hold a mirror up to ourselves and see ourselves as actors in the system. See ourselves as being able to grow and learn and expand in ways that the world tells us that we're not supposed to be able to. Old dogs can learn new tricks. It happens all the time. The other reason holding up a mirror to ourselves is so important is not just who we are individually, in terms of who we are, how we are, why we are, but it's also organizations. All the institutions also have to hold the mirror up to themselves so that we can be more aware of the bias within us. If we do not manage our bias, it will manage us. So we've hummed to ourselves. We have some consciousness now, but it's not enough. See, what usually happens is we need then to take a date, take a developmental approach to everything. Because let me tell you, once you start humming to yourself, it gets uncomfortable when we see what's in the mirror sometimes. And we have to give ourselves the space to be okay with the fact that we're going to trip up, we're going to mess up. We have to be patient with ourselves and respect our own humanity as we do that, but also respect other people's humanity who are also struggling with these issues and trying to make their way through what it means to confront and address issues of racism and advance racial equity, consciously deciding to close those gaps that we've seen. And now that we've hummed to ourselves, we're taking a developmental approach to everything. So we took that date, and now we're going to go on a diet. We're going to go on a diversity, inclusion, and equity transformation, starting with expanding our personal and professional networks. White networks, and when I say networks, I don't mean social networks. I mean the real people in our lives that we have over for dinner, folks we coordinate play dates with, those real people in our lives. That for white networks, they are over 90% exclusively white. For African American networks, it's over 80% exclusively African American. And for Hispanic or Latinx communities, it's over 60%. So we have work to do. We have to take a lot of extra steps in order to make those connections because the reality of our world is so segregated. Then we have to take all that we've experienced through humming to ourselves and taking a developmental approach to everything, going on that date, and learn and grow with the people in our world, in our spheres of influence. Because now we have a little bit more language. We can engage other people. That's how we spread the wealth. We also have to look at all of our institutions and organizations. We have to look at the policies, the practices, and the culture. We cannot be afraid to look at data or information by race. But not just that, we also have to be able to look at the levels of an institution or an organization to understand where do we see the distribution of different races. Because even in the most diverse organizations, we see that people of color are on the lower levels of those organizations, right? We also have to look at the policies and the culture. How do we set up processes that make sure that we're checking and managing our bias within institutions? How do we make sure that we are managing our bias in terms of how we show what the culture of our organizations are? What do people feel when they walk through the doors of our institutions? And last, but certainly not least, we have to remain committed and vigilant. Every time we forget the progress that we've made, we start to celebrate the success of the past and we move on. And we end up harming ourselves because we have forgotten how much extra effort it takes to keep this work going. And as soon as we stop paying attention, we start sliding backwards. And we've seen it over and over again, generation after generation in this country. Most people do not recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. We cannot allow our racial and ethnic group identities to prevent us from recognizing and respecting our common humanity, our common struggles, and our common hopes. If we do not take care of each other and the planet, we will all be equally extinct. Thank you.